Hi, my name's Dan. Welcome to the third episode of the Valhallagames podcast. Hope you enjoy it. This is a recount of a historical action fought by British and German airborne forces in World War II. The British launched an airborne operation whose objective was to seize a strategic bridge with thunderclap surprise and hold against expected German counterattacks until British armoured units could reach and relieve them. But what if I told you this is not Operation Market Garden? That instead of September 44 in Holland, this operation is a lesser-known battle in Sicily, July 1943. This operation is known to generations of British airborne as the first Bridge Too Far, which is the only battle fought between British, dubbed the Red Devils by their German opponents, and the German Fallshirmjager, the Green Devils, were each parachuted onto the same objective within hours of each other and fought tooth and nail in a bloody, desperate battle. This that follows then is a story of when devil fought devil, the battle for Primosole Bridge.
Mi fare un giovanotti ma la vita a 16 anni chiama l'onorata lo facci addestrare in tala rota regola sua esti lingua muta picciotti ma la vita state attento non sai quanto gusta lo sgarrari cercami torna a redo sin da tempo da mala vita non ti avvicinare.
Hi Dan, and welcome back to the Valhallagames podcast, episode 3. And tonight, or today, we may have something a bit special, something that doesn't involve necessarily painting any miniatures at this point, doesn't involve any rules, but actually involves the story of some real blood being shed in the Second World War. Tell us about it.
Yeah, for sure. I suppose we've thought about, tying in our history to the war games, and this is our first episode. And as you would know from the introduction, which you've heard earlier, this one is going to involve an engagement involving airborne troops from Britain and Germany. So, the Battle of Primosole Bridge. Prelude, it would be pretty hard to cover the battle in Sicily, where this is based, without sort of talking about a prelude to why we were in Sicily in the first place and why the Sicilian and Italian campaigns happened. Following victories by the 8th Army at the Second Battle of Alamein and then the advance across the desert pushing back the Afrika Corps into Tunisia, that was swiftly followed on by the Americans coming into the war, the US entering the war, Operation Torch, and pushing in from the west, while the 8th Army continued its advance into Tunisia from the east.
So Tunisia is at the very top of Africa, right on the Mediterranean coast, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
So once you get pushed up against the water, there's kind of nowhere else to go. And once you've pushed the bad guys off, then your only choice is to, if you want to actually advance, is to get across to the mainland. And I'm guessing easier than the mainland, it might be a little island halfway between. Am I guessing right?
Yeah, exactly. I guess, when we look at it, a lot of people may think from the outset that, after Alamein, of course, Churchill famously said, before Alamein we never had a victory, after Alamein...
Hang on, you need to do the voice.
No, I'll leave that to some others. Gary Oldman, I think, unfortunately, might not ever do it again now. Yeah, Churchill famously said that before Alamein we never had a victory, and after Alamein we never had a defeat, which is not, of course, true. However, he also said it as the end of the beginning, and he was very true in that the 8th Army actually sustained more casualties after Alamein and into Tunisia, into the end of the African campaign, than it did leading into Alamein. It was actually a really bloody conflict. To a lot of people, Tunisia is known as Tunisiagrad. Of course, it happened in the same year as Stalingrad, and hundreds of thousands of German prisoners were actually taken, and they lost all their material and equipment, and basically almost nothing got evacuated out of Tunisia. And it was a surrender of the Axis forces in Africa in May 43.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've heard it said a few times. This is the other Dunkirk, and in other certain places, this is the other um, a bridge too far, and this is the other uh, D-Day. So you've got some battles there that are actually quite interesting that replicate other battles that have happened since. But yeah, that is interesting. So they left, and then we decided we were going to move on and advance. And what happened there?
Well, I guess the Germans really never left. They capitulated there. Certain units were withdrawn. Certain airborne units were withdrawn, but basically the material and everything was kept there. But it's impossible really to talk about the future and this conflict without talking about the airborne troops who actually met in battle a number of times um, in Tunisia, and the remainder of that campaign, as I say, after we sort of reached the Tunisian borders. When you look at what happened there, that a number of times the actual British airborne and German airborne met each other, but the German airborne, the Ramka Brigade, had been fighting in the desert, in the Western Desert, for quite some time, famously being very hard fighters and slippery characters as well. At one stage, they nicked an entire unit's worth of transport off the New Zealanders, I do believe, and drove across the desert, presenting themselves in front of Rommel, basically saying, "Was that good enough to get one of your Afrika Korps cuff bands or not?"
Okay, that's impressive. I bet that didn't go well down at the following briefing for the New Zealanders.
No, no. The airborne, sorry, the British airborne, actually really blooded themselves there. A lot of troops were actually veteran before they joined the British airborne. They were drawn from fighting units. Not all of them. Some of them came from the Far East and so on and so forth, and weren't blooded until later. However, blooded they were. And when you look at the British Airborne's casualties in the remainder of the desert and Tunisia campaigns, they lost 49 officers and 469 other ranks were officially listed as being killed in a North African campaign. And the brigade was one of the most decorated in the British Army, the 1st Airborne Brigade. Just in the short time they operated in North Africa, they won 8 Distinguished Service Orders, 15 military crosses, 9 Distinguished Conduct Medals, 22 military medals, 3 Croix de Guerre, and 1 Legion d'Honneur.
Wow, that's an impressive array of medals, and it's really interesting. The thing that I find interesting about most of this is that your average Joe doesn't know about all this stuff. Maybe it's the American influence, here and outside the UK, perhaps. That we get a lot of American movies, we get a lot of American stuff. So you hear about 101st Airborne, and all those, D-Day and all those, highly publicised American things. But a lot of the stuff, as you say, before the Americans really showed up, or even after, from the British and Commonwealth side, you just don't hear about it, I guess, because it doesn't have the same pull at the US box offices, perhaps.
Yeah, and I guess we're going into a period of time when it was actually very much a disagreement of what happens next. The Americans had entered the war, and they brought with them extremely valuable contributions of material and equipment and innovation as well, technology, the ability to reproduce war material that we needed, and some great ideas and vitality, but also there is a balance there that we'll come on to shortly. When they entered in Torch, it would be fair to say they got a few bloody noses on the way as well, but the units that did take part there learnt from them, and by the end of the Tunisian campaign, they were able to count some victories on there too. So, it really was a coming of age of the units that participated there, and I suppose they had a lot more units that were not veteran, but they were starting to learn. I guess at the end of the Tunisia campaign, when General Alexander sent his famous message, "We are the masters of the North African shores," in May 43, the Allies then reached a point of time when they really couldn't come to an agreement as to what the next steps would take. So what Churchill wanted to do was he wanted to invade Italy, which he'd termed the soft underbelly of the Axis a few months prior. The reasons for that, really, he wanted to take Italy out of the war. He felt from intelligence briefings, and certainly it was apparent in the public, sort of in Italy, that the war had sort of declined, that the support for the war had been declining. We felt that if we could invade Italy, then we could probably take them out of the war. I don't think at that stage we thought they'd probably change sides, but we certainly thought we would remove them from the Axis coalition, which would be extremely important.
Because I know when you talk about Hitler's soft underbelly, that phrase is quite often used in reference to the fact that Hitler had his eye on Soviet or Russia at that point, wasn't it? He was sort of dedicating his forces to that, and we were trying to pull manpower and what have you away from that with the African campaigns and the Mediterranean stuff. Is that correct from what I've read?
Yeah, yeah. So there's a real impetus in there from Stalin to get some movement going and open a second front. And I'll come into that in a minute, because the reasons why we chose the second front are really important. Churchill continuing the reasons why is because he was aware also that, look, I suppose Churchill with an eye on future Europe, which he did have. Churchill had many faults, it has to be said. But one thing he did have was a little bit of an eye on the future as to what Russia's end goals, or the Soviets' end goals might be. One of them he felt was that he was concerned that if they went on the offensive and continued to have wins and move further in, then the Balkans and the Mediterranean would literally be under threat to a major land grab from the Soviets. And that
Right,
really would...
because Churchill wasn't really too trusting of Stalin for the whole war, really, and he was constantly keeping his options open for that, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. And I think for some reason, it's documented in a lot of places, various different opinions, but Roosevelt seemed to have a bit of a soft spot for Uncle Joe, for Joseph Stalin, for whatever reason. He was probably, in retrospect, way too trusting of him. Churchill maybe was at the opposite end of the spectrum and maybe didn't act in support sometimes quick enough, but yeah. And again, this is where the disagreement comes in, because Russia wanted the second front to be opened, or sorry, the Soviets wanted the second front to be open, to really take some of the divide the German forces and let them advance. Them advancing might mean they could advance down into the Mediterranean. If they advanced down into the Mediterranean, took the Balkans and into the Med any further, what it would then do is it would put in jeopardy future routes to things like the Suez Canal into the Far East. And really, if you controlled Italy, you can control a lot more, because of the extent of Italy protrudes down through Sicily into North Africa and controls the Suez as well. So with an eye to the future, it was a very strategic move going into Italy as well.
Yeah, right. That is interesting, and it's probably worth mentioning at this point that you're getting the history of the world according to a couple of blokes that pay bold action and read some books. So we're not claiming to be military historians at all, are we? Or are we, Dan?
Nah, we're just illuminating something, and there's going to be a million different things out there. And I'm going to say some things through this, and we're always going to say in different things some real opinions as well. So, look, what we're just trying to do is just encourage people to read.
Yeah,
I guess
for sure.
When you look
I'm
at
already encouraged.
Yeah. What the US was then trying to do, I guess they were reluctant to really pursue any sort of campaign that detracted from their belief that the next step was, invasion of Hitler's fortress Europe. If they didn't get their way, they were considering pulling out of Europe and basically continuing the war in the Pacific. However, Churchill, being the extremely persuasive man he is, managed to doggedly insist, and he pushed on. He pushed on, and basically they came to an agreement. at Casablanca, I believe it is, they came to an agreement. This is what they're going to do. They're going to go into Italy. Now, it has to be said that another reason that Churchill may have been assisting this, and another reason why higher statesmen in the United States may have agreed to it as well, is in reality, we have to imagine that they'd made massive contributions to the military might of the Allies, and they would continue to do so. But they also had received some bloody noses in Tunisia, and it also had to be said that they were going to be taking some really high shared positions in the Allied forces. And they'd already decided that basically the way that they were going to move ahead was they were going to share leadership. So, at any stage, an Allied general of one nation, of the US or British, was the commander of a theatre. Then his deputy would also always be the opposing nation or nations.
That sounds like fun.
Yeah, yeah. But when you have a look at it, you have to remember how the US was positioned. They had all this might and all this capability, but they also had, they had some real advantages if they went through Italy. So what they had is they could gain some valuable experience in the ability to assess their weapons. Being everything from, their armaments and way the logistics chain worked, their weapons, their tanks, everything from small arms up to tanks that they'd created. Some of them were untested as yet, although some of them had, of course, been lend-leased and had been tested. Another thing they could test is this tactical and strategic acumen of their commanders at all levels, which I'll come on to in a minute.
Yeah, well, that's right, because by the time they arrived there, the British have been playing the game for a long time. They've worked out who's in the right spot and who's driving the bus and who's sitting in the back seat, and how it all fits together. So from that perspective, they sort of had quite a bit to learn, I guess.
Yeah, well, look, it has to be said that the British, as you say, or the Commonwealth and other allies at that time had almost tested and adjusted who was in charge and stuff like that. What it could be said about the Commonwealth nations certainly is that they're possibly a little bit more consistent in the type of person that we had commanding. Not everyone's the same, not everyone's leadership style is the same, but they were perhaps a little bit more predictable. What you had, it would probably be fair to say, and very contentious, but probably fair to say, in the United States senior positions of generalship, you had a large range of ability. This is a nation that had produced a massive amount of units and manpower. To basically lead those, they then had to find commanders at all levels, and we found people that had been basically jumped several ranks, where there'd been pre-war or pre-mobilization into higher command positions that had maybe been career soldiers, but almost career peacetime soldiers as well. So largely untested. And when you look at the ability, and there's going to be names here which we'll cover in the future, and various military reviews, documents, documentaries, podcasts have done way in more depth than we ever will. You're looking at extremes such as Patton at one end.
Yeah, I'm glad you put them at the top of the list.
Yeah.
When you're
Yep.
closest to in the sentence to the word extreme.
Yep. Possibly actually there's probably no possibly about it, but at the other end you have a General Lucas of Anzio fame, and I'm sure he'll pop up again and do some research on General Lucas, a man who was removed for his lack of inertia and the ability to his fighting spirit to move forward. And in the middle you have people like General Mark Clark, who seem to position themselves on that scale wherever was best for their own future. And perhaps it would be... Now, I'm a New Zealander. We've got a history with Mark Clark, but most people have probably that fought in the Mediterranean. Their forces fought there. Mark Clark possibly be described as this type of person that when an officer comes out or a senior rank comes out to see how a bus is being unloaded or a truck's being unloaded, Mark Clark's the guy who yells out quickly, "Form a chain!" And
Right.
make sure that his officer, his commander's watching him.
Yep.
So, a lot of these people, they needed the Crucible of War to test them, to be quite honest. And when we look at other things that, an invasion of Sicily or Italy was going to achieve, not only was it going to test them, it was going to test the logistics and supply and the combined arms operations, which at this stage, with the entry of the US, wasn't just into branch, it wasn't just into unit, it wasn't even into service, it was international. And we had a vast number of material that people had never seen before. I mean, the British Army hadn't even got a plane that you could parachute out a doorway to prior than this. We were still jumping out of converted bombers through a hole in the floor.
Right.
So you convert that to now suddenly jumping out of a door of an aircraft, Gliders. The men had not seen gliders. And suddenly we're talking about glider warfare. And that's just the airborne forces, the introduction to so many different things that the Americans brought with it, and the logistical chain and shipping, and just the machine was completely different. And actually, looking back now, if you had put some of the generals that we'd just been talking about and some of the logistical problems that we've been talking about, if you had decided to invade Fortress Europe at that stage, one can only imagine the magnitude of some of the errors and how much they would have been multiplied at possibly the most crucial point in the entire war.
Sure. Yep. Yeah, I think there was a sense of that too, wasn't there? That they just weren't really ready for jumping onto the beach in France and having any sort of real success. I think that was pretty widely acknowledged, which is why why the Mediterranean was such a great learning opportunity for everybody, as you say, working together, but also within themselves to build up the confidence in things. Since after the defeat of Dunkirk and the fall of France and everything else, and Germany at that point would have seemed pretty much unstoppable, I guess. And then to finally get somewhere in the north of Africa must have been a huge relief for everybody. And then pushing on to terrain and something that was a bit more familiar than desert sand dunes was a good segue into getting back into Europe again, I guess.
Yep, for sure. And the reality is we were going in reverse to the journey that crusaders and forces had done through the centuries. The plan was to go from Tunisia and the North African coast through Sicily, through Messina, into mainland, into mainland Europe. And it reminds me of that movie Kingdom of Heaven, when the knights are going away on crusade and they ask the directions to go, and they're told, go to where the men speak Italian and then go to where they speak something else.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I never really thought about that.
Yeah. So, Italy it was. The stepping stone to, of course, the mainland was the football off the boot of the coast, which is Sicily. So the operation was set, and the island, which was codenamed Horrific.
Horrific? Okay, that doesn't sound like such a great idea.
Ominous. And the operation itself was renamed from its previous name to Operation Husky, which is possibly the only time in the entire history of British intelligence and British operations that whoever gave the code name didn't give some sort of clues, as if they were daring the opposition to uncover what the operation was entirely all about. Operation Husky being the Mediterranean, now a stroke of genius, isn't it?
Yeah, right. Okay, that's interesting.
Yep.
Great. So Husky was the name of the overall operation for Sicily, but then within that there was a number of obviously different operations for different points. And I've got a little map that I've been referring to, and as it's a big island, right? It's not just like where you have a holiday house and two roads and a corner shop. This is a big island.
Yeah, it is for sure. And I encourage anyone to get out a map of Sicily, and maybe when even those read along the storybooks, we go, now turn the page. Bring. But look at your map. If you look,
well, it's funny. It's funny you should say that, but if you go to Valhallagames.net and click on the home button, well, at least at this point in time, you'll see a map of Sicily.
Very good. Anyone would think we'd planned this.
Anyone would think.
So what is the plan then? What is the plan for the invasion of Sicily? All right. Well, for a start, let's have a wee talk about how the island's laid out. So the southern coast, obviously, is a very short stepping stone to Malta and the North African coast. Malta has been held successfully throughout the entire African campaign by the Maltese themselves and the RAF. Thank goodness. The coast itself has got multiple potential landing points, but as you go up the island, it is extremely mountainous terrain, a spine running up the middle, which basically splits in advance into either coastal route, west of the island or on the east of the island. About halfway up the island, there is a Catania Plain, which is just directly to the south of the city of Catania, and then there is a slopes of Mount Etna behind it. And then further up that coast, at the closest point to the mainland Italy is Messina. Are you looking at your map?
I am. Again, Valhallagames.net. If you have a look there, you'll see that there's actually a relief map that shows the contour lines. It shows Mount Etna, and also has some of the landing spots shown on it. So living here in the other end of the world, some of these things might not be apparent, and certainly to me, I know Malta, but actually it was just a bit hard picking out where it was. But Malta's right next to Sicily. The actual distances are quite small, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. So the plan then, amphibious landings. Montgomery is commanding his 8th Army in the east. He wasn't happy with his task force's name, so he brought back his favourite name of the 8th Army, bringing great morale to his troops. Patton, who was commanding Task Force West, not to be outdone, called his army the 7th Army, because that's just the way that it is between Patton and Montgomery.
Right. Surprised they didn't call it the 9th Army, but anyway, we won't go there.
Messina was the goal, of course, cutting off any Axis forces from their withdrawal into mainland Italy, and controlling would be the gateway ourselves, as we've spoken about, going in reverse from the old Crusades down into Africa, coming back up into Europe. So, the amphibious landings by the 7th and the 8th Army. Airborne forces, which are going to become vitally important to this story, are to be held in reserve, and then they're allocated tasks. So the US 82nd Airborne was going to be held in reserve, and then they'd conduct airborne landings in support of the US 7th Army. So basically they were used as going to be used as a firefighting force, to be dropped where they were needed at strategic points, to plug gaps in advance or to bolster in advance as required. The British, that is more or less how the Americans saw a best way to use their forces. However, Montgomery's plan, now stop me if you've heard this before. Montgomery had a plan. His plan was, in preference, was to use airborne forces as an airborne carpet, seizing and holding strategic objectives so that his ground forces could advance. So the plan for the British Airborne Division was to seize and hold with thunderclap surprise 3 strategic bridges on the route leading to the Catania Plain. Have you heard that before?
Yeah, may have heard that before, and can I tell you that one didn't end so well. But that'll be interesting then. Because also, just to bear in mind that you're the guy that's done the research on this, so thank you for that. You can send me the bill. But this is all new to me, so this is unfolding like a novel or a book, because I actually have no idea how this story's going to end. So I'm getting pretty excited.
Okay, good. All right. So we're going to seize and hold 3 objectives. The strategic objective for the 1st Airborne Brigade, comprising 1st, 2nd and 3rd Parachute Battalions, the original airborne units, plus all supporting elements which are extremely vital, including air landing artillery units, anti-tank units. Their job was to seize and hold the Primosole Bridge. Primosole Bridge covers or crosses the Simito River. And apologies for my Italian here. I have an Italian friend who's been coaching me, but I have no doubt I could do with some work. So apologies to everyone for all the names I butcher in advance. Now, the reasons why this crossing was so important was basically it's a gateway to the large Catania Plain. Now, the Catania Plain, when you're looking at your map of Sicily, is the only wide open area basically on the Allies' advance. It's the only way that they could get in any sort of formations and flank the enemy as they were trying to continue. It's the only way they could apply pressure in that way. Once they reached basically Catania and then Mount Etna again, they went into rocky spines covering the ground. So they must seize and hold that bridge if they were able to do that. Now, Primosole Bridge also is just to the southeast of a junction of 3 rivers itself. So there's 3 main rivers that cross that plain coming into one river, the Simito River. If they seize and hold the Primosole Bridge, then they only have to seize one vital point to be in control of that plain for their advance and or to cut off the German withdrawal, or the Axis withdrawal, onto that plain where they can make their getaway. So it's of vital importance.
Gotcha.
Now,
I can see it on my map, and I can see that in that relief drawing. I can see the big plain there, and I've gone to actually Bing Maps for the detail of the river. Seems a lot better than Google Maps because it sort of shows you the land features as well as just the towns and things. So there's a hint for you.
Good. All right then. So it was really a seize and hold mission for the British Airborne to hold it until armour and mechanised infantry units could move up to them, relieve them, and then continue on their advance.
This is sounding very familiar. You only have to hold for 48 hours.
Yeah,
we'll be there with the armoured.
Yep. And we're going to see once again with the airborne forces, it's extremely vital that those are held.
All right, tell me more.
So we've talked about the ground in general, in particular around the Catania Plain and the strategic reasons why the Primosole Bridge was important. I think what we'll do now is go into a little bit of detail around the actual bridge itself and the defences around its immediate vicinity, and also the dispositions of the troops which Allied intelligence believed were in the vicinity at the time of mounting the operation. So firstly, the bridge itself. The bridge is a box girder bridge. It had a sealed surface, what we'd like to call tarmacadam or tar seal these days. It had footpaths running either side with a pedestrian barrier as well. The bridge itself had a span of 156 metres and it was raised 13 metres above the Simito River. The river at the point of the bridge was about 25 metres wide. It was gently flowing, and around the time of the operation, which is July or midsummer, it was slow moving and waist height, although hidden holes could have depth deeper than head height in various points. Generally, an infantryman could find it possible to wade through. However, despite this, it was generally impassable to vehicles because it had a muddy bottom and had steep banks. In particular, the area of where the bridge spanned the river itself was particularly steep banks, whereas the further we got away from the bridge, they levelled off slightly and became gentler running down towards the river, but heavily covered in reeds. The road crossing the bridge was actually Highway 114, and it was running from Lentini, the town to the south, 10 kilometres away, and Catania, which is a city 11 kilometres away to the north, as we've already discussed. Now, to help with the defence, 4 pin-box bunkers had been built at the bridge ends for defence, 2 at either end. And on these pillboxes, the concrete had been painted yellow and brown. They had placed straw on top and then covered them in cam nets. And all this was to aid in reducing the amount of visibility that reconnaissance could have when they were looking at the bridge build operations against the defences. The pillbox themselves had barriers and blocks to control traffic. At both ends of the bridge, deep trenches have been built to withstand basically air attacks and provide cover from ground attack if required. These trenches were really well sited and they were very deep. They provided basically cover against all fire except for airburst munitions directly above the trenches themselves. At the northern end of the bridge, there was a farm. There's a group of buildings and a house, which was the Casa di Stefano. One of the closest buildings to the northern end had been taken over by the Italian troops and was being used as a garrison HQ or guard room for the bridge's defence. At all times, there was a 24-hour patrol roving the perimeter of the bridge and around the immediate vicinity. As well as that, there was expansive use of barbed wire, basically ringing the defence itself on either end of the bank. There was also nearby anti-aircraft batteries placed to dissuade aircraft and potentially an airborne assault. Now, to the northern side of the river, there was also a green belt of vineyards, olive groves and orchards, which stretched northwards approximately 600 metres. It was run parallel to the river on its northern bank. Northwards as well, just the other side of this belt, there was running westwards, a sunken track. Now, this sunken road was actually in dead ground, and dead ground means it can't be visible and it can also provide cover from fire. Now, the road itself was not able to be seen from either on the bridge or on the southern bank. So this actually became very important later on. This sunken road was actually flanked on either side by cacti, and cactus was very prominent around the area as well as other vineyards and other sort of plants and orchards. It's very, very prominent in Sicily. Poplar trees, stone walls and telegraph poles lined the highway through the belt towards and across the bridge onto the southern end and onwards towards Lentini. To the south, 1,200 metres, there was 3 prominent hills on the ridgeline, which the Allies had codenamed Johnny 1, 2 and 3. These hills were defended by Italian forces. Johnny 3 was the smallest, but it was also closest to the bridge, and had clear views over the bridge and onto Catania and the plain. Excellent fire support for troops holding the bridge and onto the plain could be had from this position. And Johnny 3 was defended by 5 Italian machine gun positions and an artillery piece. The middle hill was Johnny 1, which had further 5 machine gun positions on it and a 75mm artillery piece. This position commanded Highway 114 as it went south and controlled movement to the bridge from the south. Therefore, it was highly important that these hills were held to secure the troops or any force that was considered to be holding the bridge. Johnny 2 was opposite Johnny 1 on the western side of the highway. Johnny 2's importance was again it could overlook Highway 114, but also immediately to the north of Johnny 2 was a large open area which later was to be designated landing zones and drop zones for airborne forces. Now, each summit was ring-fenced by barbed wire and had pillboxes built in them. Some of the hills had a network of caves which the defenders could shelter in them also for further defence. Now, each one was manned by at least a dozen men and contained either an Elefantino 47mm gun or a Breda MMG. These men were well dug in, the defences were well sighted, and had ample ammo and provisions in order to last out. So these Italians had clearly read the Italian national rules and the rule book and their defensive attitude. Now, all this meant that the British airborne here were going to have to be highly aggressive in the attack to overcome them before they get caught in the open in the killing areas and the killing fields of well-sighted positions. So moving on now, I think we'll talk about the Axis forces. And the first ones that we really need to cover are the ones that the Allied planners knew were at the position at the time. So the Italian forces at the start of the Sicilian campaign, basically they had their regular forces covering main areas of approach or landings around the coast, with their more elite forces in areas of strategic interest such as ports. The remainder of the coast and other areas which they needed to hold but they were stretched too thin were manned by coastal division troops. So these coastal division troops are mainly conscripts. They were serving in a war which a lot of them found more and more unpopular, especially as the time went on, and a lot of them did not want to be there. Unfortunately, they were also led at times by officers who didn't want to be there. Many officers had retired and were forced out of retirement to lead these coastal divisions. The coastal division around the area of Primosole Bridge was 213 Coastal Division, and it was broken down into artillery units and infantry units. However, despite what could be fairly well described as second-rate troops, they had been well prepared, and the officers had pushed them into preparing excellent, well-prepared defensive positions, as was already said. They were ready and waiting.
Okay, so it sounds like they were pretty well set up then. What about the Germans? You were saying before that the Fallshirmjager were in attendance. How did that come to be?
Yeah, well, the German forces in Sicily were commanded by Lieutenant General Huber, 14th Corps, which comprised Hermann Göring Panzer Division and the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, both excellent experienced divisions. The Axis plan, in the event of the invasion, which of course came, was to concentrate their Panzer divisions against Patton's 7th Army, being the lesser experienced army group, while using delaying tactics against the 8th Army on the eastern coast.
Yeah, I know all about that because I just watched that documentary called Patton a few days ago. You know that documentary.
Yep.
Yeah. Well,
it all happened like that.
How historically accurate it was, but
especially the vehicles. It's like straight out of Bovington Tank Museum.
Yep. All right. Sorry. Go on.
Okay, the Italian 213th Coastal Division, which we've already talked about, around Catania and the Primosole Bridge, but they were to be bolstered by the arrival of the elite German 1st Fallschirmjäger Division. So the Fallschirmjäger Division was recuperating on standby for future operations, and they're based near Avignon in France. So many of the elite Fallschirmjäger had just spent a year fighting in the freezing cold of Leningrad in the Soviet Union. The division was led by General Heydrich, and comprised Fallschirmjäger Regiments 1, 3 and 4, and also airborne artillery regiments, signals, assault pioneers, machine gun battalions and medical units. So immediately on the Allied invasion of Sicily, the commander of German airborne forces, General Kurt Student, began pressuring the High Command, or the OKW, for permission to be deployed in theatre. It was supported by Hermann Göring. Of course, his namesake division was under huge pressure on the front against the advance of the 7th Army off their initial landings. Initially, it was declined by the OKW because they wanted to redeploy panzer units from the Eastern Front instead. However, these units are somewhat tied up because only a few days before, a small offensive had been started on the Soviet Union, or on the Eastern Front. You might know it, Rex, Operation Citadel.
Citadel, yes, that's the one. That's the one, otherwise known as Kursk, that I'm going to do 1-to-1 with my bolt action tanks.
Yeah.
I'm trying to
Yeah.
buy every tank on the planet to do that. But yeah, that's a big operation. And did you say that where were they planning to send the vehicles from for this one? The Germans?
They're basically planning to send it from the Eastern Front down and basically into Italy, and across and reinforce them. But of course, once the largest tank battle ever in history had kicked off, and the Germans were not going well for them, their panzer units are somewhat tied up there, and they couldn't spare them.
Yeah, and that's a long way too. I don't imagine that's a 5 minute journey. I don't know how they get tanks there. Train, I guess, but
Yep.
man, that's a long way.
Yep. But it was something which the Germans pretty much excelled at, really, getting their guys around. Much to the detriment later in the war and in the final days of the war to any civilians and anybody else they wanted to move. But that's a different story. So basically, now High Command had no other choice. They got to utilise any highly mobile troops that were ready to go. So they turned back to the Fallshirmjager and Kurstudent's men, and they decided they're going to deploy the Fallshirmjager to the theatre. So General Heydrich was ordered to Italy, and he was done briefed in person by Field Marshal Kesselring. And in so doing, he was ordered to mobilise his division and start sending his men to Sicily without delay. However, being a man of action with airborne initiative, Heydrich had already told his men and the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment to follow him to Italy and ready to be deployed. And the units which he'd also sent was not only that regiment, but indeed elements of the machine guns, pioneers of signals battalions, as well as anti-tank companies. So really, his foresight in being a man of action had got them even closer and resulted in even smaller delays. Now, the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment, which is the regiment most involved in this battle, was under Oberstleutnant Ludwig Heilmann, who was known as King Ludwig to his men. And he was a seasoned veteran. He had started the war and served through Poland and France, and then he volunteered for the airborne, and he was also a veteran of the Crete invasion.
What was his name again?
Ludwig Heilmann.
Okay, I just wanted to see if you could roll that off the tongue the same way you did the first time. Well done, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've got that right, but that's my best effort. So Heydrich had phoned Heilmann, and he had tasked him with personally carrying out a recce of potential LZs or landing zones for the airborne insertion around Catania by the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment. And then his job was to move south to link up with the Hermann Göring Division. So that was the first phase of the operation. The second phase of the operation would see the machine gun battalion and signals company land at Catania airfield by air landing. And they were going to move south across Primosole Bridge and hold the ground to the south to prevent German forces being cut off by advancing allies.
So just a question on that then. So this is German Fallschirmjäger and other forces coming in to Primosole Bridge. At this point, were they aware that there was an invasion happening?
I'm basically going to come on to that. So what happened was Heydrich basically made a phone call later on to Heilmann and told him that the night before the Allies' invasion, the airdrop around Primosole Bridge, and they'd guessed that they were going to need to make a major move strategic move to basically move further into the island on the Allies' behalf. So he basically told him that something will happen in the next 24 hours. You're to take your unit and you're to stay south of the bridge so you can hold it so that we can withdraw and the Allies can't move across it. And you're to place one company between the bridge and the coast so you can't be flanked. So amazing strategic forethought by him, and placed him in a really, really good position in the Allies' way.
Yeah, that is good. That is good planning for sure.
Yep. Now, not only is there 2 waves after the air landing forces came in, there's actually going to be a 3rd wave of Fallschirmjäger as well, which consisted of the Assault Pioneer Battalion and the Anti-Tank Battery, and they were going to be parachuted directly around Primosole Bridge. So those units would all then be bolstered by the arrival of the 4th Fallshirmjager Regiment, which is going to be airlifted in again via the airfield at Catania, which is 11 k's away. And the 1st Fallshirmjager would move by train and ferry across down through Italy and into Sicily. So suddenly what had happened was, without any knowledge of the Allied intelligence or planners, one of the most elite German units they could possibly fight against was inserted into the area without them knowing.
Okay.
Yeah. The winds of war. So basically what happened then is the forward elements of the HQ of the 1st Fallshirmjager Division moved in. They landed in the airfield near Catania. They landed in the middle of an air raid. And Heilmann, Hauptmann, Stangenberg basically drove to the area of Primosole Bridge, where they selected drop zones following their reconnaissance. And then they telephoned the headquarters of General Heydrich, gave him the coordinates, and Heydrich gave it the okay. Meanwhile, Hauptmann Sprecht, not sure on my pronunciation there, but that had also accompanied them, had sped in Catania and basically had requisitioned through every tactic possible, all possible trucks and transport, and he got them into a column, and then he made best possible speed towards the drop zone, and he got there with the transport just as the first aircraft of the Fallschirmjägers approached. So as they got there, fires are lit by setting fire to haystacks, and the smoke and flame basically marked the beginning of and ends of the drop zone. It was at this stage not quite dusk, but it still made the drop zones really, really obvious and avoided the need for any sort of beacons, and it was a method which the Fallschirmjäger had used on previous drops before in the war. Of course, as they came across, it was a massive drop. They landed without any Allied or air or ground attack, and 1,400 men of Fallschirmjager Regiment 3 dropped from over 100 Heinkels. So the reason there was no Allied air attack is because the Germans had simply planned it to happen because the Allied air sorties had been finishing every day at 1800 hours, so they could fly back to base for tea and medals and get themselves a good night's sleep.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's not particularly good planning. Or it is good planning on the other side.
Yeah. So, once on the ground, the Fallschirmjäger formed up smartly in an organised manner and moved to their pre-selected positions. What happened now is that they're obviously in an excellent position to counter the Allied advance of the 8th Army. They didn't expect any airborne assault, however, directly on top of them. On the 12th of July, the further air-landed troops of the second wave moved south on Highway 114 and dug in particular around the area of the Johnny features, which we've already spoken about. And in so doing, inadvertently overlooked perfectly the areas that were designated to be the drop zones and landing zones for the British airborne. So held commanding positions overlooking the area. They were also told that further reinforcements, as per the plan, a third wave would follow in the next few nights with the Fallschirmjäger assault pioneer regiments and anti-tank units being parachuted into them. And that will become important later. So again, Heilmann had warned his commanders that something bound was happening the following night, the 4th of July. So he sensed the enemy was about to try to sneak through, and he'd be sending more troops. The Allies, would be sending more troops either by sea or air. If we manage to land them in our rear, dig in well, we'll be cut off for sure. So take them in, hold the bridge, and place a company between yourself and the coast. So obviously their strategic appreciation was spot on. The 1st Parachute Brigade of the British Airborne have been training now for weeks in the hot African heat, and finally they've been briefed on their mission. The mission, of course, is a capture of Primosole Bridge, and holding until relieved by the 50th Armoured Division, led by 4th Armoured Brigade. Sorry, the 50th Division, led by the 4th Armoured Brigade. And basically, where they're going to advance, they're going to hold the bridge and then relieve the lightly armoured airborne forces. The Parachute Brigade commanders, General Lathbury, gave his final briefing to his battalion commanders. So objectives: the 1st Parachute Battalion under Colonel Pearson would drop on DZs immediately north of the bridge, and to the south in the DZ by Johnny 2. They would then assault and seize the bridge itself. 3rd Parachute...
So they're attacking it from both ends, correct?
Correct.
Yep. So, so I have a question about the hold until relief thing. So at this point, so it's armoured that's coming up to help them out after supposedly 48 hours. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So it's 50th Northumbrian Division, which comprise a lot of regiments in that part of the country, in particular the Durham Light Infantry. They are, of course, supported by armoured units, and in this particular case, the advance on Primosole Bridge was to be units which included Shermans from the 4th Armoured Brigade, which included the Royal Tank Regiment.
And are they already on the island at this point?
Yeah, they're pushing inland from the landing points. And what had happened was they had been briefed, and Montgomery had given them specific instructions in their part of the briefing that for the operation they would carry out at all possible speed to the bridge. Speed was of the essence. They would not stop at anything until they reached the bridge because it was of such strategic importance.
Okay. Go on.
All right. So 3rd Parachute Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Yeldman, would jump into a northern DZ further north of the bridge, just by a kilometre or so, and then overcome resistance there and become a blocking force, blocking the approaches from Catania and any reinforcement of the enemy from there. 2nd Parachute Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Johnny Frost would jump into DZ south of the bridge and immediately above, ironically, Johnny 2. Their mission would be to seize and hold the dominating high ground of Johnny's 1, 2 and 3. Air landing assets, so medical, anti-tank, engineers, etc. would land by glider as close as they could to the bridge, and their mission would also be vital. Medical, for obvious reasons, anti-tank would set up so that they could repel any armoured assault by the enemy, and engineers' tasks would include removal of what they believed to be demolition charges on the bridge so that the Germans couldn't blow it, and from there, improvising defences, etc.
So when you say anti-tank, you're talking about Piats with 12-inch range, right?
No, so basically the Piat was at a platoon level, but the anti-tank guns in this particular case were the 6-pounder, and they had been loaded into gliders with a jeep tow, and because of the cancellation of the 2nd Parachute Brigade's mission, because the Allies had simply advanced too fast, the second Parachute Brigade, their mission had been cancelled. So that freed up additional anti-tank assets, and they had another 3 guns added to their allocation for the mission, loaded into gliders.
Okay, so yeah, glider transported actual anti-tank guns. So that's good because those Piats, they're not much for a long-range attack, are they?
No, not at all. And as we're going to see later on, sometimes you'd be thankful of them though, because when they're not there, you do miss them.
Right. Okay.
Bring up the Piats.
All right. Tell me more.
All right. So that's the mission. So little did they or their men of the airborne forces know that the DZs are already held by their old enemies, and they're in fact flying into a battlefield dominated by the enemy as prepared, dug in, targets marked and recorded. Now, that's the mission. How they get there, and the problems were compounded already before they even met the enemy. Now, the initial airborne operation, 9th to 10th July, by the 1st Air Landing Brigade, which is spoken about already, had been a success by the slimmest of margins. And air landing forces, of course, are landed by gliders, so it's predominantly glider operation. What happened was the seaborne forces were beginning to land right at the very start of the Sicilian invasion. The brigade amassed in an armada of 144 troop-carrying horses and heavier equipment in Waco gliders. So remember, we're talking now about the initial operation by the 1st Air Landing Brigade, not the one at Primosole Bridge. It's very, very important we understand what had happened and the repercussions.
So gliders, obviously we know about gliders from post D-Day and that sort of era, but surely gliders, as you alluded to earlier, that they hadn't seen them before necessarily, some of the forces. Gliders, this must be very, very new for glider-borne attacks.
Yeah, well, they were fairly new for the Allies, of course, but they had arrived in time to begin training on them. But yeah, there was lots of things, in particular the Waco glider, which was carrying the heavy equipment, was particularly innovative. The horses had been there a little bit longer. Yeah, it was very interesting. But I mean, the Air Landing Brigade had been training on it, so they were getting close to being pretty proficient on it. That's where the exercises which are run in particular in Tunisia and North Africa had become really, really useful, and the men of the Airborne had spent a lot of time doing really, really intense exercises. 1st Airborne Brigade in particular had run a bunch called the Cactus. The Cactus exercises, Operation Cactus, which really were a bunch of exercises where objectives had no names but were vaguely similar to the objectives they were due to seize in Sicily. Now, so this operation happened days before, and the initial landings on the island, where the men landed in gliders. Basically, as the massive armada of 144 gliders came in to the coast, the wind started to blow them off course. It was so strong that initial pilots started to take evasive maneuvers to get back on course. What happened then, there were inexperienced pilots behind them then started to climb or lose height. Gliders actually started to collide amongst each other, and massive confusion followed. What happened then was, with all the pilots adjusting heights, so on and so forth, they hit the coast at the wrong height. Gliders were cast off miles off the sea, off the coast. They didn't have enough height to reach their objectives. Many crashed into the sea. So the 144 gliders that set out on that operation, 7 turned back for technical reasons, 72 had to ditch in the sea, and only 44 landed within even 10 miles of their original drop zone.
Wow, okay, so that answers my question of alluding to the fact that the whole thing's pretty much untested.
Yep. The guys had been tested getting out of gliders, what they're supposed to do. The problem is that for all that material, what we actually needed we needed experienced pilots. Now, I'm going to come on to it in a minute because it's important that we talk about it a little bit more, the quality of the transport aircraft that were pulling the tug aircraft, that were pulling the gliders, but also, more importantly, we're talking about the Primosole Bridge operation, the quality of the pilots and flying the transports. So I'll come on to that in a minute, Rex, because that's a really good point. On that operation, only 4 gliders of 144 landed on the intended landing zones. At the end of the operation, only 1 platoon of men of the South Staffordshire Regiment, led by Lieutenant Lawrence Withers, captured the bridge at Ponte Grande. That was the brigade objective.
Lawrence Withers, I wonder if he's a relative. He must be, because obviously he's a great guy. He made it to where he was meant to be.
I don't know, but I thought you'd like that little snippet of information. That's our last name, everyone. So, yeah, so basically it came to brigade objective, and 1 platoon ended up taking it, held it by the slimmest of margins. So, coming back to your question, though, there was a really key issue, was the erratic quality of the American pilots. Now, the 51st Wing were the pilots of C-47 Skytrains and Dakotas, and many of these guys are pilots from passenger transport airlines and freight before the war, or before the Americans got involved in the war. Unfortunately, due to technology which they had in that aircraft, but not in the rather basic military aircraft, their navigational ability was seriously in question. In fact, so much so that when they were flying in parachute drop training operations, they had to fly in a V formation behind a lead plane, which had a competent navigator in it. Because if they'd flown in train and anyone broke formation, they flew at night, they lost visual contact, etc. with that lead plane, they did not have the ability or the skill to fly to the target.
Oh, sounds like a nightmare.
Yep.
Sounds like a nightmare. So many moving parts. This is before we even get out of the plane, let alone get on the ground, let alone engage the enemy.
Yeah. So I mean, the inexperienced and the untested, and they're untested in extreme situations, such as the ones they're going to encounter, which are being under fire, and all these factors are going to really have some serious repercussions to the British airborne troops, which we're going to hear about.
Were they at least green and they get to roll to upgrade?
Yeah, we might hear about how they were forced to upgrade in a minute. So then, the planning for the operation continued. Eventually, briefings are held for the other ranks of the brigade. At that time, each group was shown into planning tents, where they had massive pictures and finally saw their objective for the first time, Primosole Bridge and its surrounding features and terrain. Also, there was a large model made in the briefing tent, which the men were to file past and memorise the areas. And for those of you who haven't seen it, if you go onto a blog, you can actually see a picture of the model being constructed in the briefing tent, thanks to Rex finding it and posting it up there. Thanks, Rex.
Yeah, you might need to check back on the date. That is on the 7th of September 2018, because there'll be a few posts probably between now and when you check in on this podcast to look.
In 2025. For those of you playing along at home, well done, Rex. Right. So, they learned at that time that the operation was Operation Fustian. It was revealed that within the seizing of the bridge itself, and the bridge was codenamed Marston. And they are all, of course, on the island of Sicily, which is codenamed Horrified. And I think I might have said horrific earlier, but it's Horrified. So, it was...
I'm horrified thinking about those gliders ditching in the water, so that works out about right.
Yep. Now, I spoke already as well that the 2nd Parachute Brigade's operation had been cancelled due to the rapid Allied advance. What happened then is the 1st Brigade, after all their briefings, after all their training, they were tuned to fever pitch. They'd finally found out where they were supposed to go, and now it was a case of hurry up and wait, like ages and generations of soldiers going back to ancient times. Hurry up and wait. So they had a nervous wait. The order to emplane and begin Op Fustian came on the 12th of July. However, later that afternoon, the op was postponed for another 24 hours. Finally, at 6:30 p.m., 1830 hours, 13th of July, 1943, the brigade major in the signals tent received the signal, giving the green light for the mission. It said simply, Marston tonight. And this time the party was on. So I think we might take a break there, Rex. What do you think? Let's get a drink and wet our lips, and then we'll come back and we'll continue with the operation.
Sounds good. I'm pretty excited about it. So we play bold action, right? But we're wargamers first and bold action players secondly. But I'm thinking that this is a great opportunity for an intergame campaign. Wouldn't it be great to not only game those platoon actions on the ground, but to game some of the events leading up to it as well? I'll get out my pen and my quill and parchment, and I shall start work on that immediately.
Sounds good.
See you back up to the break.
See you in a minute.